Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today, we're going to a state we haven't gone to before. We're going to Arizona. We're visiting with the guys from Whiskey Del Bac in Tucson. And I have with me Mark Vierthaler.
Vierthaler.
Vierthaler, so close.
Yes,
Distiller.
good.
And Stephen Paul, founder and owner. Stephen, Mark, welcome.
How are you? Good to be here.
Doing well, doing well. Glad to have you guys on. So we'll jump right in here. So as I said, this is the first time we've gone to a distillery in Arizona. So I know you've talked about the history of how the brand got started before on a couple of other podcasts, and we'll reference them throughout. So I wanted to jump right a little past that to what the Arizona distilling scene looks like, what it looked like when you started and what it looks like today.
Well, I think there are maybe 10 active distilleries in the state now. We were the second one to get licensed in, I think, 2011. The first one being one called Desert Diamond up in Kingman. And yeah, so I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Hold on. I apologize. I have hearing aids that are connected to my phone, and I haven't quite figured out how to bypass that yet. So I'm so sorry.
No worries. No
oh
worries.
my God. It's welcome to geezerhood. So yeah, the distilling scene in Arizona is kind of not well developed. I think there's a few that are making good product, some that aren't yet, but yeah. So we had a kind of fledgling guild. We have a fledgling guild which kind of fizzled during COVID, and we haven't really done anything since kind of the COVID situation improved. So yeah, we're the funny thing is, early on when I was doing festivals, right after we started, putting product in bottles, Arizona had a bad reputation as far as wine goes. Like, we've been making wine here for a while, and people would taste our whiskey and go, and then they'd pause and go, "Oh, this is actually good." And so there was a little bit of a hurdle there. Anyway, yeah, so that's kind of the this rough sketch of what's going on here.
So I should assume then you're not doing any local wine finishes in the near future.
No, but actually the wine scene has gotten a lot better over the last kind of 10 years too. So that's could be a possibility down the road.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So with those, about 10 distilleries, just throwing a number out there. I mean, how many are making whiskey really? Or are they mainly like gin, vodka, other spirits?
I'm saying about 5 or 6 are doing
right.
whiskey. I think there's a couple of single malts being made. I think Santan Distillery up in Phoenix is making a single malt, and I think Elgin Distillery down in a little southeast of us is making a single malt. I think there's one called Grand Canyon that is also making a single malt. Yeah.
Not surprised to know, or to find out rather, that there's a Grand Canyon distillery. That I haven't been to the South Rim. I've only been to North Rim. North Rim not favorable for distilling, but the South Rim probably a little bit better. So, as I mentioned, I've listened to you guys on a couple of different podcasts, just trying to get information about to make this episode more interesting for you guys, more interesting for listeners too. And one of the things I wanted to start with was something that came from the Stephen, when you were on the Single Malt Matters podcast, and this was just part of the origin story that mesquite wood, which you'd worked on through furniture business, through early iterations of the distillery, mesquite wood creates a lot of waste. And I had to look up what a mesquite tree looks like. As you can imagine, not a lot of them up here in New York City. So I wanted to ask you particularly about trying to use mesquite wood, not only for what you had been using it for, and for smoking, but also when you tried to barrel with it, when you tried to create a barrel out of it?
Well, okay. So, yeah. So, my wife originally, as you probably heard, had this idea to dry malt over a mesquite fire instead of a peat fire like they do in Scotland. And I just, when she came up with this idea, I was totally captivated. And then immediately I had two other ideas. One, to make a barrel out of mesquite, char the inside and, age single malt whiskey in it. And so yeah, I did. I made two little barrels, and it ended up tasting horrible. I thought it was going to taste fantastic, and it was just very tannic, very acrid. The mesquite was extremely aggressive. In fact, the color was amazing. It was like this deep, kind of red color that was kind of pretty. But yeah, bad whiskey, bad idea. And then also, another little thing that my wife will never let me live down. I don't know if I had mentioned this in that one you were listening to, but I also, in making one of those, it was a little two-gallon barrels. And I, in 25 or 30 years of woodworking, I had never lost a digit. And just milling out staves for one of the little barrels, I had an accident and lost the end of one of my fingers on my left hand. And so just a, 3/4 of an inch, but so that will go down in infamy in terms of this whole whiskey project from my wife's point of view. But it is a kind of a badge of honor, though, to have joined what is in the woodworker circles is called the Nub Club. So
I loved that term. It was so perfect. It's like never trust a shop teacher with all 10 fingers intact kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. So I had to start on that one because I'm obsessed with barrels at the moment and figuring that out. You said you were milling them yourself. Had you created barrels for furniture use before that?
No, never. And that's like trying to, instead of bending a very small, staves for a very small barrel, I was trying to mill that curve into the barrels. Gotcha. To the staves. And so that was what was difficult. Yeah. Again, I mean, this barrel, a 2-gallon barrel is probably, 14 inches long and, 10 inches in diameter or something. So pretty little.
Right. All right. So when you started, or actually I'll rephrase that. I'll go back to the end and then go back to the end. Towards the end of one of the interviews, don't remember which one, you were asked very point blankly, would you ever make a bourbon? And immediately, nope. Hold on. So I get that now, but I don't think I've heard why maybe the story of why you went with a single malt in particular when you decided to start the distillery.
So my wife and I have always consumed single malts. And I actually really don't gravitate toward bourbons. It's not my favorite spirit. So yeah, the vision was a single malt whiskey that was, truly from the desert Southwest, like a very regional American single malt whiskey. And that was kind of the motivation. And so that's what we pursued. And so yeah, having said that, we are about to branch into another type of whiskey that we won't make. We're going to put a desert spin on it, and we'll be going public with that pretty soon. But as far as what we make, it'll always be American single malt whiskey. Yeah.
All right, it's a little teaser for listeners coming up.
Yeah.
All right. So Mark, when you came to Whiskey Del Bac, your previous distillery, you come from, was it 10th Ward?
Yes, correct.
So as far as I saw, they don't create any single malts.
Right.
So what was your learning curve like when you came on?
It was kind of a bit of serendipity because one of the things that we were kind of known for and really focused on at 10th Ward was doing a little bit of everything. It was kind of this let's take old school production styles and let's put our own spin on it. And one of the last things that I laid down on oak before I left 10th Ward was a single malt whiskey. Yeah. And so, but at 10th Ward and at Boot Hill, which was the distillery I was at before 10th Ward, yeah, we had never really done American single malt whiskey. And it was something that I was always, very intrigued by and was familiar with what Whiskey Del Bac was doing. I had heard about them out on the East Coast and was able to even sneak a couple of bottles a few times to familiarize myself with it. And really just was one loving the idea of specializing. Having worked at 2 distilleries where we did a little bit of everything, gin, vodka, liqueurs, bourbon, rye, the idea of doing one thing and doing one thing very well was very appealing. And also kind of like what Stephen has touched on, that idea of a sense of place. When I got into distilling, the question that people would always ask is, well, what are you trying to make? Are you trying to make Maker's Mark? Are you trying to make, I was like, no, we're trying to make whatever it is we're going to make. And Whiskey Del Bac had really leaned into that and had created this American single malt that leaned into the terroir of the Southwest desert. And so it just, it was a learning curve. I had the advantage that the team that I came into, Dustin, Raymond, and Abby, had been doing it for a while. They knew the ins and outs of it, and I was able to really lean on them, at the very beginning to be like, hey, you guys are the experts in single malt. I am not. And so there was just this amazing chance to learn and to see how things were done and, to take that time to experiment too, and to be able to lean on Stephen's knowledge, with 10 years of experience within single malt and, the production staff's knowledge. It just, while there was definitely a learning curve, it made it infinitely easier on me.
And like you said, you could sneak a few bottles, so you got to, study before you got there.
Exactly.
I will add though that Mark has come in with vastly more experience than I ever had, and more experience than the 3 team members had, and really more than any other distillery we've had here. We've had 2 other head distillers after I kind of stepped aside very early in the game. So anyway, Mark's been a tremendous asset to us in terms of his knowledge and kind of ability, willingness to explore, problem solve, all kinds of things. He's been really great.
Fantastic.
Making me blush.
It's audio only, but he is blushing, ladies and gentlemen. So to jump off of that point of experience, now in 2022, we've got 140 plus distilleries around the U.S. making single malt, what we think of as American single malt, and we'll get to the proposed legislation or proposed standards of identity later on. But you got 140 out there. Stephen, when you started, and for that matter, Mark, when you were just starting in distilling as well, there were not that many out there. As of 2010, would have been basically like McCarthy's, Westlands, maybe. I think
Stranahan's, maybe.
Stranahan's, maybe. So very
St. George, I
St.
think.
George, yeah.
Right, St. George is one of the other ones. Largely Pacific Northwest. I think even your neighbor in the next state over, Santa Fe Spirits, was 2012, so that was still another year or 2 away. So when you were deciding to create a distillery that would produce single malt, who did you look to for inspiration and guidance?
Well, first of all, I was so naive that I didn't know that there was a craft distilling movement either. So I thought I was doing this like super exotic thing, and then as I started to get into it, I realized, oh no, there are a bunch of people that are doing craft distilling, and so in terms of, models for single malts, I really wasn't. I started to meet through some workshops and things like a fermentation workshop in San Diego, and a kind of 1 week distilling workshop by ADI. I started to meet some other distillers, and I met the guys at Kings County. They were doing bourbons, and I wasn't really looking at single malt producers per se. I was looking at other craft distillers for just kind of trying to help, trying to figure out, just trying to navigate the landscape. And so yeah, what I found was that, there's a great sense of camaraderie. Lee Medoff at House Distillers, the guys at Kings County gave me a ton of advice. The guys at Garrison Brothers in Texas, helped me. So to answer your question, I really kind of wasn't even aware of those single malt producers per se. I was just kind of trying to figure out how to make a craft distillery go.
Less about the grain, more about the apparatus around it.
Yeah. And then, though, I should add, as time went on, and the Single Malt Commission was established, and by the way, they didn't know about us when they started, so we were not a founding member. I think we were number maybe 12 or 14 to come into the commission, but yeah, that was a real eye opener for me, and I was like, oh heck. Like for a little distillery that's got all our eggs in the single malt basket, this is huge. This establishment of the commission and what their mission was. So yeah, I joined right away, and yeah, they've been really critical to I mean, obviously, look what just happened in terms of the TTB, and so yeah, that was pivotal. And so as I learned that there were more single malt producers, I met Colin in Santa Fe, and others. And so, yeah, and the sense of camaraderie within the single malt producers is really fun.
And I think that's shown nowhere better than in the fact that I have, as of this recording, hopefully it will be published by the time this recording goes live, but I have an article out that's kind of the guide, your basic guide to the American Single Malt proposed standards of identity. Spoke to Colin, spoke to Owen at Stranahan's, spoke to Steve Hawley, and one of the biggest things that I came away from these conversations was the focus on speaking with one voice, and how even before these regulations were posted for public comment, that the emphasis was on one voice. If you want to deviate, that's fine, but just not in this group. And everyone kind of voluntarily going along with these regulations and self-regulating, I guess, within the industry, which is amazing to see 100+ distilleries doing that. It's really impressive. And if it makes you feel any better about, not being one of the founding members, I've heard that Benny's back room where it was, where the idea was hatched was very, very small. So it may not have been comfortable. So take that for what you will. But I was thrilled to hear about particularly Kings County, Garrison Brothers. I'm trying to get Donis on the podcast. It has been just murder trying to get in touch with that man, but we'll leave that for another day. But the guys at Kings County, Colin, I visit them at least once a year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it really is. They're only 11 miles away, which is like an hour and a half drive, but they're only 11 miles. So anyway, so going into it from the perspective of the apparatus and the distillery first, knowing that you wanted to create a single malt, but making sure you had the distillery down first. Ultimately, why Arizona? Why Tucson?
Well, I'm from here. And I have a, profound sense of place. I really love Baja, Arizona. It's a magical place in terms of the landscape, the quality of light, except for like June, July, and half of August. The quality of light is not so good. And it's actually not a magical place in June and July. August, during our rainy season, does get magical again. But anyway, no, I actually grew up till I was 11 in a hotter desert than this, at Palm Springs. And when I moved here, I just thought, I was so taken by how actually lush the desert is. I mean, it's probably hard for you to imagine, but we get almost too much rainfall to qualify as a desert. And so we have almost 12 inches of rain a year. So consequently, there are the flora, the fauna here is so exotic. We have things like Gila monsters and javelina and coatimundi, which you guys listening can all look up if you want. They're like a raccoon, but more kind of almost more endearing. And you know, all of these crazy animals, and then the plant life is also so exotic. And I should probably stop rambling here, but yeah, it was out of a love of place. And I had a long relationship with mesquite wood, having built furniture from it for so many years. And that actually came out of a love of place as well. Real quickly, early on as a furniture designer, I realized that if you wanted spectacular grain, you had to go to rainforest woods. And then which I wasn't inclined to do. And then I realized we have this really beautiful wood growing all around us, mesquite. And so it's a hard wood to deal with. I could go on about that, but yeah, sense of place. I mean, a sense of place and a profound, really love of the Sonoran Desert. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have done anything. If it wouldn't have been here, I wouldn't have done it, So.
Hey, that's fair. And that is the answer that I get most often when I ask that question of why here. But that, it has to be pointed out that for you, Stephen, in Tucson, Mark, in Maryland as well, single malts are not really indigenous or common to either one of those. At least now in Baltimore, you've got Old Line producing there, and I guess to an extent with Santa Fe over to one side, and then Balcones and Garrison on the other side, got some in the Southwest, but single malt's not really from those areas, if you want to put it that way. But before I get to that, actually, one more question about the location itself, which was Whiskey Del Bac is in what I would consider, the main metro area of Tucson. It's not on the outskirts. It's not in Tucson, but it's really a 20-minute drive, 30-minute drive outside. So why decide to build a distillery in a metro area as opposed to outside the city?
Available warehouse space, essentially. And so we didn't build, we lease. And so, yeah, that was, I had to find an industrial zoning that had enough square footage. And yeah, so we're literally 10 minutes from downtown Tucson. So yeah, that's the simple answer.
And look, it makes sense. And I've gotten a growing appreciation for what I call garage distilleries. and I mean that in the most positive way. It's those ones that, you pull up the steel sheet in front and you walk in. I don't know what the front of Whiskey Del Bac looks like, but that's often the case in New York City, at least. We don't have a very appealing public face.
Yeah.
We get a lot of visitors, but it's hard to find, and it's in an industrial park. So yeah.
Right. The distillery has a face for radio. It's okay. So with the location you're in, as you said, it's a desert that kind of just makes it into the desert. You got, from what I heard, 2 rainy seasons the one in the summer, and then when's the other one?
Yeah, so the summer is our big one. We typically get like 6 inches of rain, but from July through July and August. And then we have over the rest of the year we get the rest of our rainfall, but during the winter we probably get maybe 2-3 inches typically. So yeah, but the monsoon season, the really spectacular, pure blue sky in the morning, puffy clouds building up over the mountains as the morning progresses, developing into these huge, cumulonimbus dark clouds that basically burst into rain in the afternoon. Not every day, but every day there's a threat of that. And so the drama is really great.
It's like living in Florida for 2.5 months, basically.
Okay. Definitely, if you're interested, look up some photography of monsoon season in Tucson in the Sonoran Desert. It is awe-inspiring. I feel like it's the literal definition of awesome.
Yeah.
It is full of awe.
True, yeah.
Absolutely fair. And also, to be fair, Mark, I promise I have some questions for you too. So just hang with me over there. With the mesquite wood that you were using, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. I always have an outline and I'll go on tangents, but I try to go back to the outline whenever I'm not sure. So with the Sonoran Desert, you're at a kind of a moderate to low elevation for a desert. I think it's like 2,300 feet elevation, something like that.
Yep.
So lower elevation, a desert with rainfall. So some kind of, not contradictory, but more gray area kind of desert. So when, what does this mean for the environment in which you're distilling and aging the whiskey?
You mean what impact do we have on the environment, or what does the environment, how does the environment affect our whiskey making?
I mean, I meant the latter, but the former is also a good question.
Well, real quickly on that front, distilleries use a lot of water. So we have, just like the whole West and so many other parts of the country, really, water conservation is huge. So we have a long ways to go. We've made strides in our conservation measures. We still have a long way to go on that. We talk for a long time about agriculture and industry water usage. So we won't do that today, but it is a real issue that needs to be addressed. And so we're doing our darndest to address it in our little operation. Maybe I'll start a little bit, but I'll let Mark take over on how the climate affects our whiskey making. The biggest thing is actually, why don't you just riff for a while?
Sure.
Maybe I'll jump in.
Yeah, no. Probably the largest impact that we see is the temperature fluctuation. It's very unique because, especially like when you get into the early to late spring before you get into the summer, you will have these massive temperature swings within 24 hours. And we're talking like this winter, it struck me that I could get up, go out my door, and it was 31 degrees outside. And by the time I left, work, I left the distillery, it would be 72. So you'd have this 40-degree swing in a 24-hour period. And as you know, ethanol is extremely volatile and it responds incredibly quickly to these variations in temperature, these variations in humidity. And so we're getting a lot of push and pull in these barrels in a short amount of time. And then because Tucson is unique, when it has this, when we have our monsoon season, we're also seeing those fluctuations in humidity. Like, we will have winters where it's 5, 6, 7% humidity, but in the middle of monsoon, you can have days where it's 20 to 30%. And so every single one of those things is having an impact on your aging process, what your angel share is going to be, the level of tannin extraction that you're getting from the wood, the level of lignin extraction. And we had kind of talked about, this was born of this love of place, and it leans into that affection. And that's part of it, is having these major impacts. You are getting a single malt that is going to be completely different than something that you're going to see coming out of Scotland, or something coming out of the Pacific Northwest, or even something coming out of, like Balcones in Texas. Like, it is just such a unique and brilliant. Again, I come back to terroir, and I struggle with that word sometimes, even though we've established whiskey terroir as a thing, but it is
everyone struggles with that word, so you're good.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, like that's probably the largest. Kind of going back to the first point that Stephen had made, another one of the big impacts is, us trying to keep a close eye on how we are utilizing those resources as well. We're constantly looking at ways we can save water. So we adjust our mash process to try and be a little more efficient. We, make sure we're looking at yeast strains that are going to be a little more amenable to the pH that we're dealing with. And so, everything that we're doing, whether it's, leaning into the environment that we have around us, or doing our best to minimize our impact on the environment, plays a role in that final product that goes into the bottle.
And I'll add too, so we do malt for our mesquited whiskeys. And so the malt, all the things that Mark just mentioned affect the, how we approach malting seasonally as well. So yeah, it's the climate here is very, very unique. That 40-degree shift, in temps in a 24-hour period that Mark mentioned is called, you may know this, but it's called the diurnal shift. A couple of months ago, it was pointed out actually at the ACS, actually at the commission meeting, the diurnal shift in Scotland is about 6 degrees. That's their delta, low to high, in a 24-hour period. so yeah, it's real different here.
Yeah, that's insane. Where do I want to go now? There's so many places I want to go here. So with the diurnal shift being like that, I would imagine there's also some kind of a latent effect from the environment, from the temperature and humidity swings, that perhaps a whiskey won't taste different if you were to go in and sample from a cask. The whiskey may not taste different at like 9 a.m. versus 9 p.m. Maybe it does, but you would certainly notice a difference in the taste by season, which is how it's interacting with the wood. Mark, as a distiller and as you're managing the casks, how do you kind of account for that and deal with those changes?
So one of the things, we're lucky enough that we're small enough that we can sensory every one of our barrels as we come to harvest it. I was having a conversation with Nicole Austin at Cascade Hollow, and she had made the comment about how when she had gone over to Dickel, the hardest thing she had to learn was how to taste without being able to taste everything. And like, that's a challenge. But with us, we are small enough that myself and our production team, every week we will sit down and we will pull between 12 to 24 barrels, and we will go through and we will sample every single one of those. And if it's going into something that's going to be a special release, we will take very intricate notes. But say for a lot of our core SKUs, it is just a matter of, is this checking those boxes that we need for consistency and for a high quality product? It is interesting, like we've already discovered just from looking at our proof and our yields from each barrel, we age in maybe a 950 square foot space. But there is a distinct difference between the barrels that are on the bottom pallets and the barrels that are on the top pallets. And sometimes it may just happen that a set of barrels from the same batch number, one ended up on the bottom, the other ended up on the top, and you're going to notice a change in that. And so for us, it's a matter of, we know, like, we have our, kind of platonic ideal of what the whiskey in the bottle needs to be. And we also know that within this set of barrels, we're going to get some barrels that are going to be maybe a little too heavy on tannin by themselves. But if we take this other barrel that is going to be like this big vanilla bomb, we know we can take the two of them together and it's going to get us into that range that we want. And it is also a matter of when we harvest, laying stuff down in the winter. We know we need a little extra time because it isn't going to have as much interaction with that wood. We're not going to have those massive temperature fluctuations. Laying stuff down in the summer, we maybe don't have to wait as long on that because it is having 110-degree days. And so it is just a matter of keeping good track of data and having the palates and having the group of people that can taste it. Every one of our palates is different. And so to have the four of us, or occasionally we'll rope Stephen in to force him to drink whiskey at 10 in the morning when we're doing our barrel harvests. But it's just a matter of knowing how your rick house is going to react. And then again, while this barrel, when you taste it by yourself, you're going to go, well, this isn't right. Knowing how to blend it for that final product is key.
Gotcha. And you're absolutely right. Nicole kind of went from, I think, directly from Kings County to Cascade Hollow. So quite a jump, let's say. It was just, I didn't get to stop at Cascade Hollow, but I was just down in Tennessee. So I passed by it. And I wish I had time to stop in just to take a look. So I want to jump back for a second. And Mark, I know, Stephen, I know we're going to have to let you go a little bit early. So I definitely want to hit this one last area before we let you go, which is the evolution of the stills you were using to create this whiskey. So if I've got the history right, you started with kind of a 5-gallon playing around, went to a 40-gallon, and a couple years later, eventually to the 500. Where are you at now?
We're still on the 500-gallon still. So yeah, and it's making really good whiskey for us. It's a pot still. It has a little kind of 4-foot tall column on it, but there's no reflux component in it. And so yeah, it's not as pretty as my little alembic 40-gallon still was, but yeah, it's making really good whiskey. So we just did a production expansion a few months ago. We doubled the size of about 5 tanks. Probably the next step would be adding a still. So yeah, we almost doubled our production capacity with sizing up our fermenters and some of our HLT and CLT and some other things. So we took on some more floor space next door. And so yeah, still on the 500-gallon still though.
And I'm curious, you said no reflux component. What does that do for the flavor, and why that decision?
Well, I mean, as you probably know, in Scotland, they just use pot stills. And the more you, just for your listeners, the more you distill, the more times you distill, the more flavor you lose. So a reflux column still basically redistills the distillate as it goes up the column. And so you're kind of losing flavor there. Now you can turn that off. Some people have a combination where they can turn that off. But anyway, we weren't interested in any kind of vodka or gin necessarily. So we just went with the pot still. I mean, we're basically riffing on the Scottish model of whiskey making. So there are some differences in terms of aging. We age in new oak primarily, although we do a lot of finishing and special casks. But using that Scottish model whiskey making was kind of my kind of guidepost in developing the distillery.
And I have a note here that you had two kind of guides with that. The first one being you wanted a Speyside style in terms of taste, and the Macallan 12 for level of quality and caliber for that.
Yeah, so that so I always gravitated, oddly enough. I mean, occasionally we drink, Islay scotches, but I usually gravitated toward Speyside or Highland scotches, and as you know, they don't use any peat or much peat to dry their malt in those regions, and so yeah, actually the Macallan 12 was my model for our Whiskey Del Bac Classic. And so, yeah, but so oddly, the real brainchild of the whole project was to kind of use the Islay model with this desert wood. And so yeah, that became really the whole reason we started this whiskey project was our Mesquite Dorado. And by the way, we're trying to push that term into the national vocabulary, mesquited instead of peated, and it's definitely gaining a lot of traction nationally. So
it's a good phrase. I mean, it's accurate more than anything else. It's accurate.
Yeah.
You're not going to find peat if you're looking at Whiskey Del Bac. It's not peat.
Yeah.
It's
No,
smoke.
you're not.
It's smoke. It's different.
Yeah.
And I've got a whole tangent and a whole group of people who I've got to do a peat tasting with, just to understand that peat does not equal smoke, and there's a whole, there's books and libraries that can be written on that. But anyway, with the Speyside style and the Macallan 12, I mean, when I tried the classic in particular, immediately my mind went to Speyside. It was incredibly fruity, a little less malt forward than maybe a Glenfiddich or Glenlivet would be, but just the fruitiness itself, stone fruits, orchard fruits, was classic Speyside Highland. And then going over to the Dorado with the whiskey smoke, it was a very different whiskey for me. It had like I said, the smoke, it was not overpowering at all. It was very what I would consider mild. If you're someone who doesn't drink smoked whiskeys at all, it's probably going to be strong for you. But it was a very mild, subtle smoke meant to impart flavor rather than blow your palate out. Thing. So when you were designing the Dorado, and I really mean design in whatever sense of the word you want to take it, how many variations did you have to play around with before you kind of settled on the smoke level? If applicable, the ppm level that you wanted?
I guess I can address that in terms of when we did start putting stuff in bottles, like when we started bottling whiskey, the first Dorado expressions were like a little over the top. I mean, they kind of hit you over the head with the smoke. And so I think at least twice and maybe three times over the first, I'm going to say 4 years, we dialed the smoke level back by blending in a little bit of our classic with the mesquited whiskey that had come out of the barrel. So now we've got it to a point where we really like the balance of the smoke, and all the underlying flavor profiles. So one thing that I was very pleasantly surprised at learning when I first tasted what we were making in terms of the mesquited stuff is that the mesquite doesn't give you that those medicinal notes that the heavily peated Islay scotches give you, and actually that kind of component is what I never really liked about those Islay scotches. And so yeah, Dorado is just softer on the palate, and it doesn't give you that kind of Band-Aid iodine note that the peat gives. So yeah, it's a very distinct flavor and aroma. I mean, sometimes I tell people the mesquite smoke is very evocative of a desert campfire. If you've grown up or camped in the desert ever, or walking through your neighborhood on a winter's night when people are burning mesquite in their fireplaces, and it's very kind of evocative and just a wonderful aroma.
Yeah, it has that very kind of dry rub smoker, not even a barbecue, but a dry rub smoker kind of taste to it. I really love it. I've now only had a couple of whiskeys that use mesquite. Glad to add the Dorado to that list. And with, let's see, one other part that I wanted to ask about with the mesquite in particular. No, I'm going to cut that question out.
You'll take it.
It's good. We're good. So we'll go back to Mark. When it's just you and I, we'll go back a little more to the malting process and the nitty gritty of that. But before Stephen, before we let you leave, I do want to talk to you both about the standards of identity and the proposed standard of identity. Now, Stephen, when you were on the Taste of Arizona podcast, this is about a year ago, October 2021, you were hopeful that you'd have regulations in place by the end of December that year. Federal government being what it is, hey, we've got to step forward. We've got a proposed standard. And I think by the time around when this episode goes live, the comment period will have ended, the public comment period. So, first off, how excited were you when it finally was like, oh my God, they're going to put these out? And what are you seeing from your seat at Whiskey Del Bac in terms of what the next steps will be and what the timeline looks like?
What the timeline looks like, you said?
For formal categorical recognition.
Yeah. So we're coming up on a couple of months here. So the 60 days is getting close to the end. The commission is going to, you talked to Steve about this, I'm sure, and so you probably know this already, but the commission is going to submit the comments, basically our collective comments, as one voice. And then apparently they will take 30 days to evaluate. The TTB, that is, will take 30 days to evaluate all the comments, and it's almost, they've asked, so all the comments they will take under consideration, and then it's kind of like a poll, I guess, on certain somewhat controversial things like flavorings and things like that. And the 30 days, I am not sure if that is written in stone. We are not, it's taken 6 years to do this. So I think our expectations are probably on the low side. But when it happens, boy, it's going to be cause for celebration. So yeah, super excited. My emotions were like through the roof when they finally decided to, said that they were going to post the designation beans. So just like every other single malt producer, although being a distillery that is solely focused at this point on American single malts, that means a lot to us. So yeah, I just joined the board of the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission. And so I'm kind of starting to get over my awe at my fellow board members, because I really have a lot of respect for what those guys have done. And then just kind of the intrepid, nonstop, just never say die efforts that they've gone through. and especially Steve Hawley. He's been amazing. So yeah, here we are. We're ready to rock and roll.
Hey, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you've been taking advantage of that podcast-only code for the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society. They've got around 20 bottlings coming out each month, and there's never a shortage of new things to explore. This month's focus, their October distillery dive, is Distillery Number 5. This famous lowland distillery will show you something completely different, and you've probably never had before. This isn't your floral and fruity Speyside, but it's also not that smoky, sometimes medicinal, and maritime Islay. It's truly unique and in a category and region all its own. The Distillery Dive bottlings were announced on October 11th, so you might still find some available. If not, keep an eye out. There are always more bottles coming from this distillery and others, and always new journeys to explore. There are also currently 5 fall bundles available, packaging multiple bottles together from sometimes the same and sometimes different distilleries into a discounted set for you to discover. Remember to use the promo code WRP for 20% off your annual membership, and you can visit the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society website to sign up and order via the link in the show notes. And I don't think this will cause any deviation from the one voice. But you mentioned earlier that Whiskey Del Bac uses mostly new oak barrels, with the, if I heard you correctly, with the exception of when you're using for finishing casks. Right. For Whiskey Del Bac specifically, or is that still the plan going forward? Still new oak regulations won't change anything about that?
Yeah, let me pass that over to Mark.
Yeah, that is the plan. One of the things that I tell people when they come in, so not only do we kind of deviate by utilizing new oak, we also break with tradition by mostly using quarter casks. Majority of our aging is done in 15-gallon barrels. And one of the reasons that, we're obviously excited about the designation is it does not specifically give limitations on the lower end of cask size or whether it is second use, third use, first use. And there is, some negative connotations around utilizing such small format barrels. But I always tell people it's just because a lot of distilleries haven't figured out how to use them. It is not a 1-to-1, 15 to 53. You have to adjust your production practices to utilize the format correctly. And, as Stephen has said, and, I will always say, I think proof is in our bottle that if you know what you're doing, it doesn't really matter because we're producing whiskeys that are getting named 2021 Wine Enthusiast Best of the Year. And we're getting 93, 94, 95 ratings consistently. And so for us, the plan is to continue to lean heavily on new oak. One of the things that we have started implementing over the past quarter has been utilizing our own barrels a little bit more. We have started playing around with second fill and even some third fill of our 15 gallons. The goal with that is one, to be a little more responsible environmentally versus doing a one and done and then it goes out the door. So the more usages we can get out of it, the less footprint we're having. It makes more sense for us financially. Small format barrels are very expensive. Their prices do not scale with their size. And also it helps with the addition of adding a little more complexity. Again, as with most American whiskeys with rye and bourbons, going into that first use barrel creates very punchy flavors. It's very heavy on tannin, very heavy on vanilla. One of the reasons I think, like you had mentioned, you don't get that malt forwardness in the classic like you do, say, with a Speyside is that new barrel. That new barrel is, for better or for worse, kind of overpowering that malt base sometimes. And we'd like to play that up a little more. And, I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever got when I first started distilling was the day that you taste something you've made and you're like, this is absolutely perfect, you need to stop distilling because there's always room for improvement. You can be a little more efficient. You can create more complexity. You can. And so I don't foresee us moving away from new barrels anytime soon, because we've created, again, a very unique product that we think is high quality. Now it's just kind of turning our eyes to what can we do to create additional nuance within that.
Gotcha. And I'm going to throw one more question while Steven's still here, which is, and it's going to take aim at something you just said, both of you just said, which was about ratings and reviews and awards and such. So this was thrown back a little bit, also on the Taste of Arizona podcast. This is, Stephen, when you had your daughter Amanda on with you, and something that she said really resonated with me, which was that she prefers reviews to awards. I'm reading this to make sure I get this right. Prefers reviews to awards because reviews give more engagement and discussion, leading to a greater knowledge and learning about the product. So I say that because while the awards are, they're well earned, they're well deserved, and as are the great reviews, I'm curious if that mindset is still the mindset that you go with, that the education about it and the learning about the product is ultimately more important than the award.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we
definitely.
Yeah, like we're all about education. We love to talk about, so really awards and ratings are about public acceptance, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so, the more we can talk about what we do, why we do it, the level of passion that we have for whatever it is we're doing, all those things, those increase, consumer engagement. And so yeah, better to be able to educate and talk and, and relate and tell why we're doing what we're doing to folks than, just getting the awards. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Yeah, and I would, to kind of echo that from a distiller's standpoint, one of the hardest lessons you learn is to not take negative feedback personally. The joke that I make, like when I ride along, anytime I've ridden along with salespeople, has been like, I feel a little bit like when the distiller is riding along, you present the bottle and you say, here's my heart and soul. Please shit on it. But getting those ratings, whether they're good or bad, is beneficial because, sometimes when you are surrounded by people who love you and encourage you, you may not get the most honest feedback. It may be like, yeah, no, this is great when it's terrible. And so having someone who owes you nothing to be able to say, this is outstanding, it's nuanced, it's balanced, that means a lot. But even on the other end, getting that feedback that says, this feels off, this feels a little too hot, or it's over extracted. That is information that we need because we drink our own Kool-Aid. And so to know how people actually feel is absolutely, it's priceless. But also then to not take that too far, to also have enough confidence in your product to, when someone says something, and go, you're wrong on this one.
Yeah. Gotcha. David, I would love to keep talking to you. I would love it more than what I have to go do now, which is talk to potential investors. We're doing a capital round. And so Mark's capable hands are going to be totally great for the next portion of this. And I want to thank you. This has been so pleasant and so fun, and I admire the amount of homework you did. So that's not often seen, actually.
We'll see what Mark reports back afterwards. He may not be as appreciative afterwards, but Stephen, thank you so much for your time. I promised you a clean exit, so best of luck, I should say.
Thank you
with the investor round, but we'll give you a clean break. Thanks so much for taking the time, and we'll take a quick break.
Real quickly, David, if I could just say, if you ever are tempted to come out to Southern Arizona, we would love to show you what we do. And we'll show you around Baja, Arizona too. It's a fun place.
I would love to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay. Good luck. Ada, do you want to go with Pops? Hi. Go with him.
All right. It's just you and me. No,
Excellent. I will do my best to stay same level so you don't have to mess around with your audio levels too much.
No, sounds good so far. Yeah, I'm gonna include this as a little break. Put my sponsors in there. So I'm thinking to the next I'm only gonna keep you another half hour max.
Perfect.
I'll keep it tight on that one. But definitely just talk a little bit more about the maturation. I want to go back to the grains, the yeast you mentioned. Then just looking over. I have to ask how you're maturing in the warehouse, like done at your brick house kind of thing. And yeah, I think we'll start with that. There was one other question. I'm just looking at one other note that I made that maybe you can answer, but I'll throw it to you before we go back, just in case. So in 2018, a previous, I don't think she's with Whiskey Del Bac anymore, but I did not write her name down. I had her name before, but she was on the Spirit Guide podcast with Pedro from 7 Grand in San Diego and elsewhere. And of note was that the classic at that time was 84 proof instead of the 92 proof it is now, as is the Dorado. But she was speaking specifically about the classic, and I was curious about what initiated that proof change.
Yes, I can speak to that.
All right, perfect. All right, so we'll jump right back in. Thanks for listening to that little sponsor break. I am thrilled to welcome back Mark. We're still at Whiskey Del Bac Distillery in Tucson, Arizona. And we've lost Stephen, of course, for the rest of the episode, but we're going to get into some really on the ground, in the still house kind of questions here, some rapid fire and some discussion. So first one is just to clarify a couple points that we had talked about earlier, which was number one, the maturation. So you said that you're maturing in a 950 square foot space, which to me is insane because my apartment's about that size and it's overflowing. I have 1 barrel in here and I can't imagine having however many you guys have. Granted, it's 53 gallon, but still, I can't imagine. So within that space, how are you setting up the barrels to age?
So we switched over, it would have been, I believe, around 2020. We switched over to high volume palletized, high density storage. So in the past, obviously, we did kind of the traditional rickhouse setup on barrel racks using a mix of, traditional metal barrel racks as well as some unique custom ones that Stephen had built. But as we grew and as we, were staring down the barrel of even more limited space, we realized this was something we needed to start exploring. In 2020, we actually brought on our current CEO, Kent Cheeseman, who's formerly with High West. And he had actually oversaw their move into high density. And so, we looked at the pros and cons, and it just kind of came down to, we need to find a way to be more efficient with how we're utilizing our space. And so currently again, it is a very tight space. We utilize 6 barrels per pallet. Those barrels are strapped down and then we stack those 5 pallets high. And then that is in I'll have to go back and look at my notes for exact numbers, but essentially we have about a 10 by 10. So 10 rows by 10 columns. I can tell you off the top of my head that if we are utilizing the entire space and is completely full with barrels, we can fit around 915 gallons aging at the same time. So yeah, it's just a matter of, laying things out, keeping a close eye on efficiencies and yeah, just look, kind of the reality of having to work with what you have at the time.
Sure, fully understandable. So when you made that shift over from the, as you said, the more traditional rack style to the high density, high volume palletized, immediately my mind goes to there's going to be less airflow around the barrels, and particularly with the wide temperature and humidity swings that you guys go through, how, I'm finding it difficult to figure out exactly how to ask, but like, how did you taste a difference in the whiskey from the changeover, and how has it affected the internal structure of the aging and the whiskey since the changeover?
Yeah, definitely. Probably the most noticeable impact, and this kind of goes back to what we were discussing earlier, was noticing the bottom of the stack and the top of the stack. They can be right next to each other. You can have the exact same batch, and it is going to be different. You are going to have, a little more astringency on one versus a little bit of softness on the other. One thing that we did, though, is obviously realizing that condensing these so much, we are going to have a lot less air movement around it. We actually did place the rickhouse and aging directly underneath one of our negative airflow fans. And so even in the winter, when things cool off, we constantly have those fans running. We're just making sure we're pulling as much up from the bottom to the top and getting as much out and bringing as much fresh in. It did also then force us to, again, be a little more aware of our sensory on each of those barrels, where, as in the past, there was a little bit more leeway of, we can reasonably expect these barrels in this section are all going to taste within these set parameters. All of a sudden, you're dealing with less air movement, you're dealing with higher concentrations of ethanol within specific areas. It just came down to, we kind of need to know what's going on in each and every one of these.
Gotcha. So I'm not sure I've heard it before, or maybe I haven't heard it in that way, but the negative airflow fan. So how akin to that is a heat cycling, or for lack of a better term, just having fans on in the distillery in the warehouse to move air around.
Mm-hmm. So basically, as opposed to, say, like a traditional fan where, it's going to be spinning, it's going to be pushing that air. What that's doing is we have a fan on the roof that is drawing air out through the roof. So that does help with the air movement. And I'll have to double check on that, but we have two of them, and I know it's not a 100% true negative airflow, obviously, because then we would have to have air input coming through.
Right.
But basically, what we are doing is that is working to kind of dissipate that ethanol buildup, as well as to keep basically just air moving around those barrels.
Right. So it's you're not really trying to counter Mother Nature too much. It's more just
right.
Like I said, just keeping the airflow going, and importantly, making sure there's not too much ethanol in that air.
Exactly. I think of it. So I grew up in the Midwest, and we had what we called our attic fan, which, if someone cooked bacon or burnt something, you'd flip on the attic fan, and that would just basically try and suck all of that air up through the roof to clear that out. That's essentially how these blowers are functioning. In the summer, they also have evaporative media on them. So they essentially function as swamp coolers in the summer. So that does also help keep our production area a little less miserable when it's 110 out.
That's fair. I visited a warehouse in Kentucky. It was only, quote unquote, only 90, 92 degrees, but it's like 95% humidity. And my friend and I were just dying in that. And their warehouse was just the top half of an Amish barn. So it was not a huge space, but they're using 30 and 53 gallon barrels. And it was hot. It was terrible up there. It's a lot of fun, but it was terrible. We were both we lost 10 pounds in an hour-long tasting.
I would say just that water weight.
Yeah, just the water weight. Better than any diuretic. But so with the barrels too, I wanted to ask this. There was a point in the past, I know that you played around, Stephen had played around with different size barrels, from anything from that 2-gallon Mesquite barrel to potentially trying some 53s as well, and also the barrels for aging. So besides the barrels for finishing, rather not aging, finishing. So talking about your standard barrels, you use mostly 15-gallon. I have a note that at some point Whiskey Del Bac was experimenting with like a 30-gallon or as large as a 53. Uh, I think you may have answered this anyway, but just to double check, you settled on the 15 eventually because that was just the one that fit the whiskey profile the best.
Yeah. So obviously, like a lot of smaller craft distilleries, 15 was good because you get faster extraction, so you're able to put out an aged spirit a little bit faster. And over the years, the original head distiller, along with Stephen, again, were able to dial that in and figure out we need to be making more narrow hearts cuts because we're obviously not going to have time to let some of that oxidation take place and let maybe some of those unpleasant phenols burn off. And so for a long time, it was just kind of a matter of necessity. Like a lot of craft distilleries, that's where a lot of decisions come down to
Fair.
This is how we have to make it work. And yeah, like we currently have 3 53-gallon barrels that are sitting out there aging right now. One is 4 years old. The other two are just over 2. They're not where we're happy with them yet. We still pull and taste them about once a quarter just to see how they're developing. And then for 30s, in the past, Whiskey Del Bac has used 30s not uncommonly. The complete and utter banning of 30s can be laid at my feet. I've never liked 30s. I've worked with 53s. I've worked as large as 70, and I've worked as small as 5. It's just been my experience and my personal taste that 30s tend to be an odd size, and I feel tend to leave a little bit of astringency that you don't get. And my theory, I have no science to back this up, but my theory is because it's kind of in a mushy middle with 5, 10s, and 15s. Again, if you know what you're doing, you know where to make your cuts, you know when to start censoring the barrels, and you pull them before they over extract, or to let them sit a little extra so you can get these punchier notes into maybe a short aged 53. My experience has been with 30s, it tends to be in this range where it sits too long and you get that same over extraction, or it sits too little and you kind of have a flat tasting spirit. That's not to say that there aren't people out there that are making delicious whiskey with 30. They are. It's just that was kind of one of the things when I came in was like, let's keep exploring 53s. Let's see how we can develop that profile. It makes more sense financially. We're storing more whiskey in a more cost-effective barrel, but it kind of is also, we know what we're doing with 15s, and let's lean into that, and let's continue to develop those flavor profiles.
It makes sense. Absolutely fair. Still using through all that the number 3 char from Barrel Mill.
Yes. So we do a medium plus toast and then a number 3 char on top of that medium plus toast. One of the reasons that we really, and we make sure when we're getting our barrels, it does have that medium plus. One thing that struck me about single malt, especially because we are producing it in the more traditional Scottish style, which means we are fermenting and distilling off grain. We use a traditional lauter tun. We're producing a traditional distiller's beer. Other distilleries I was at, we did the American model of on-grain fermentation, on-grain distillation. That creates these big, bold flavors. But with the off-grain, you have this more kind of delicate flavor profile going into the barrel. And I always like to compare a charred barrel versus a toasted and charred barrel is like the difference between a well-smoked rack of ribs and setting ribs on the grill to simply char the inside and outside. Yeah, you're technically getting the same thing. You're getting cooked meat, but a nice low slow, you get that lovely smoke ring inside of the rib. That's kind of what the medium toast is doing. That's letting some of those sugars get extracted a little bit nicer. And again, just really accentuates a little bit of that nuance. And that's especially important using those smaller format barrels. Again, larger format, you can let them sit, you can let them develop. We hit 10 months and we're starting to sensory. And I think the longest we've ever really left anything in a 15 is around 15 months.
Gotcha. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the toasted barrel. It's one of the few crazes of the last couple of years that I'm behind. Not everyone did it well or did it with the right reasons, but
Right.
when done for the right reasons, with the right thought process behind it,
Yes,
it
I
makes a lot of
always,
sense.
the conversation I always have, and I always tell my staff, and granted, the decision for the medium plus happened before I came along, but I agreed wholeheartedly with it. But as I always tell the staff, I've done this for a reason. It may not be a good reason. And I may backpedal on it and be like, wow, that was a terrible reason. We should never do that again. But the point is, yeah, that purposefulness, we have put some thought into why we want to utilize it. And that is one where that has definitely paid dividends for our product.
Awesome. And going to that, you said you keep things in a 15-gallon about 15 months. Is that what you said?
Our average is a year, but we start censoring around 10 months. Kind of going back to what we talked about at the beginning, the seasonality plays a big impact. If we know, we've laid it down in the summer season, we had an especially, like 2020, we had an especially arid monsoon season. Like it was actually one of the worst in years. Those didn't have the advantage of having a little bit of extra humidity during their aging process. And so we had noticed when we were censoring and pulling that those had a more punchy, kind of more astringent note. And so we actually had to spread some of those barrels across multiple blendings. So, gotcha. So that's why, again, 10 months is, we're going to start checking on it. Average is a year to 13 months. And then the longest is usually around 15.
Gotcha. All right. So we've got about 15 left. And I've got, of course, way too many questions as always that can't be answered in the time period. But the next one I wanted to jump to was that a previous employee, I don't think she's with Whiskey Del Bac anymore, Dale, had been on a podcast that I love to listen to, which is the Spirit Guide podcast with Pedro from 7 Grand and the associated establishments. When she was there in 2018, this is one of the earlier episodes that they did. The Whiskey Del Bac Classic was at 84 proof, and I was listening to that, and it was after I had tasted the current and the current Classic and the Dorado. And I noticed that now it's at 92. So when and why did that changeover happen?
A handful of reasons. The 84 was really nice, but as palettes developed and, as we kind of expanded our reach and we got more and more feedback, we started to hear kind of, as and currently now, one of the big fads is, barrel strength. People people want that higher ethanol. They want that spice. They want that heat. For us, it was, So for us, it was actually a slow increase. We actually originally increased the proof to 90. And had really good reactions to that, got a lot of really great feedback. Then the final pitch to 92 was actually mostly based on an aesthetics thing. One of the things that we're very proud of, we do not chill filter. We run our product through a basic paper filter before it goes into a bottle just to catch any char that may come through. And, when you have some of these super oily batches, say a bottle hangs out in an air-conditioned truck or, sits on a shelf in an air-conditioned liquor store, you're going to start to see flocculation. You're going to start seeing those little wispy clouds. And some people saw that, noticed it, and not realizing what it was, complained to us. And they were like, something's off about your product, some things. And so for us, it was kind of, after playing around with it, 92 is still a really nice balanced proof. It's not overly hot. You can pour it. You can enjoy it neat. It still has enough punch. You can add ice cube to it if you want. And it also just kind of waylays some of that flocculation as well.
Makes sense. And oddly enough, that explanation didn't even come to my mind. I was thinking the taste part made sense. The move towards barrel strength made sense. I didn't even think about that. And that's usually something that I do because I hate chill filtering.
Blom Brothers, who are great guys. I don't know if you ever talked to Mike or Matt, but they have one of the best little pieces on their labels of all of their whiskeys, and it says never chill filtered because we're not monsters. And we take that same approach here. Like, we will do filter to make sure you're not getting any extra protein or char into your bottle, but that's
totally acceptable. That's totally acceptable. I'm okay with not getting a mouthful of barrel char fragments. That's good. I may hit you up for Brown Bros afterwards, because I would definitely love to talk to them at some point.
Yeah, I'd love to share. They're great guys.
So, and actually that's a perfect segue into the next question, which is about collaboration. So tomorrow, in what I think will be the episode that comes out after this, but tomorrow I'm recording with the guys over at American Mash and Grain.
Oh, excellent.
And your whiskey, so the Whiskey Del Bac Mesquite Smoked Single Malt, was the last component of that whiskey that I had not tasted by itself. I had the Watershed, the Weigel, they say Wiggle, but Weigel Monongahela Rye, and of course Spirits of French Lick's been a frequent double guest on the podcast. But I hadn't tried Whiskey Del Bac yet, so I'm glad we got to try that before tasting the blend, because I want to taste the components before and after. So how did that collaboration come about from your standpoint?
So Devin reached out to us originally a couple of years ago before I ever came along. He had actually spoken with Stephen and had really focused on this idea of distilleries that are using small format barrels and are using them well. Again, for better or for worse, unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there that are doing short age stuff in small barrels, and it's not good. From Devin, the way Devin has told the story was basically, they always had this idea that they eventually wanted to create their own blends, to start exploring the different ways, the different styles of whiskey around the US that, can be come together to create something that is different from the sum of their parts. And so he reached out to us around this time last year and basically had pitched the idea to Stephen and I and said, I've already talking to Alan at French Lick, and I've already had some conversations with Watershed, and they're showing early desire. And for us, Stephen has created this entire culture within the distillery of collaboration, and high tide raises all ships, and which was one of the reasons I was attracted here, because I believe the same. Like, I can give you my mash bill, I can give you my yeast, I can give you my pitch rates, I can give you every single piece of my production process, and you will not create something that tastes like mine. And so for us, it's those opportunities to be like, yeah, let's support our fellow distillers. Let's create something that is greater than the sum of our parts. And so the conversation, kind of started that he was like, he's like, obviously, we're known for our Dorado, we're known for our Mesquite smoke. So he knew he wanted something to utilize that. And the caution that I always give people, and I am a smoke fiend, I love heavy smoke, I love heavy peat. Like, that is one of my personal favorites. I did just give him the caveat of Mesquite is difficult to work with. If you're not careful with Mesquite, it can become astringent. If you're not careful with Mesquite, it can nuke everything else. And so we sent them, I want to say 4 or 5 samples, some private barrels, some finished barrels, and what I call our commodity Dorado, which is just our standard blend. And they tasted through it, and he reached out and he's like, yeah, he goes, no, that Dorado with a little bit of that classic in it, that's where we want to go. And, that has also led us to, we collaborate routinely with Lost Lantern and their independent bottlings. And again, just that idea of we're all in this together, we're all working towards the same thing, and working to also fight against this idea that craft distilling hasn't matured in the US. Stephen talked about Arizona's reputation for the wine industry and people tasting the whiskey and going, oh my gosh, this actually tastes good. Every distillery I've ever been at, either as a distiller or helping, that has always been the feedback, is when you hand someone something good that's craft distilled and they go, oh my God, this is actually good. Yeah, it is, because there are a bunch of us who know what we're doing.
I mean, that's very fair. And honestly, I've also not only tasted, but I've also spoken to all the people on this label now too. or the people behind it. And I do trust all of them to put out a good product, a solid product that's going to stand on its own, but also work together in a blend and showcase how far American craft distilling has come in the last 10, 15 years. Because it really is an amazing story to come through. I'm also glad I did note, but I didn't mention that you guys do work with Lost Lantern frequently.
Yes.
That's great. Love Lost Lantern. Had Nora and Adam on a couple episodes ago, and I'm excited to see what their fall and winter outturns are going to be.
We may be in a couple of those, so
that's what I've heard some rumor about that. So that is good to know. So I have a couple of other questions that I think I'm going to follow up with you on email about. They're very small technical questions about the yeast and the grain variety that I know are far more interesting for guys like us than even for the nerdiest of audience members. And you know who you are, and I love you for it. So just looking forward as we close out. I've also heard rumor that you are building a new distillery.
Someday.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. As I'm sure those who have been listening have picked up on, we keep talking about space restraints. We have been very lucky. The reception to us has been wonderful, and that has seen an increase in our market share. We did expand a little bit more in our current space to include storage for finished product, more storage for barrel space, things like that. We'll trip that trigger. If things go as they keep going within the next couple of years, we will have to very seriously look at building a new distillery, which is a good problem to have. But we're not quite there yet.
Fair, totally fair. And then last to ask you just now is distribution. So I know New York and California, aside from Arizona, of course, are some pretty large markets, and I know I could find you, thankfully, at Total Wine near me.
Yes.
I mean, it's the biggest Total Wine in the country because you're only allowed to have one of them in New York. We have some weird. You think any state has weird laws? We've got some weird ass laws here.
Everywhere. Distilled in 3 different states. I've worked in the industry and more, and all of them are just bizarre and arbitrary.
Exactly. If you're a chain with a multi-state chain, you can only have one in New York. So what do? They made it the largest by volume Total Wine in the country. It's in the same parking lot as the second highest volume Costco and the third highest volume Walmart in the country. So you can imagine that area is just so much fun to drive and park in.
That sounds like a dream, honestly.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. It takes as long to find a parking spot as it does to drive down to Kings County. So with that, are you expecting in the near future to expand to any other states than I know you were in, I want to say 17 for some reason. That number's popping out to me.
Yes, between 17 or 18. I always feel bad because I'm able to play ignorant sometimes and be like, yeah, I don't know where we're available. I just make the juice. But yes, so we're always looking at expansion, but I'll say the word again, purposeful expansion, purposeful, we've had people reach out to us, but we don't want to grow just to grow. Obviously Arizona's our number one, followed by California and then New York. So those are our 3 biggest, but we're also available in Oklahoma, Missouri, Texas, and I'm going to get in trouble because now I've started listing off and I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. But
you're in New York. You're not going to piss me off, so you're good.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll do the default. Go to whiskeydelbac.com. There is a list of all of the states that we're available in there. But yeah, we're always looking at doing it and doing it purposefully. And the other key is also making sure that our quality stays high. There's always that fear that we do everything in house. We're a 100% own make single malt whiskey company. As Stephen alluded to earlier, we are doing a little bit of expansion and finding some ways to put a unique spin on some more traditional American whiskeys, not bourbon. But, we want to make sure that the quality stays where it is. We don't want to sacrifice quality for volume.
It's perfect sentiment to end on. So with that, Mark, hang on with me for a second after we finish recording. But in the meantime, where can people find Whiskey Del Bac?
Yeah, so find us on whiskeydelbac.com. That has a full list of everywhere we are distributed. We can do direct-to-consumer shipping in Arizona and Kentucky, which is something that we're very excited about. We're on social, in particularly Instagram and Facebook at Whiskey Del Bac. And yeah, just we are big. We're focused on education. We just launched a brand new website, so that's going to start having some more educational pieces on it soon as well. So, and if you want to find us and we're not where you're at, reach out to us, and maybe we're looking there right now.
Never know. You want to be state 18 or 19? Now's your chance. Now's your chance. Well, Mark, thank you so much, and of course, thank you to Stephen for taking the time as well tonight. I'll put all the links for the website, social media in the show notes, as well as reviews of the products of the Classic and of the Dorado. I'll probably end up linking also the eventual review for the borrowed page, American Mash and Grain, because you guys are part of it, so you should be linked there as well. And with that, please do, while you're listening, like and subscribe to Whiskey Podcast on your podcast app of choice. It really does make a huge difference in rising up the charts, attracting sponsors, getting fantastic guests like Mark and Steven to join the podcast and really, spend time talking nerdy stuff with me. So thank you so much for listening, for supporting on Patreon, and we'll see you next week.